Today, I'd like to talk to you about fear. The kind of fear that looks like this. The kind of fear that grips you, slides into your throat, and keeps you awake at night. The kind of fear that makes you want to run away and hide. This fear isn't actually the monster it appears to be. It looks like a monster, and it feels like a monster. But to the writer, and to any and every kind of artist, this fear is actually a friend. This fear is what we need to be feeling in order to create or paint or write anything of worth. This fear is the measure of our originality, of our drive to reach deep inside ourselves and draw out an idea that is honest, original, and true. An idea that doesn't just retread the same old paths. An idea that tries to break new ground, to fit our understanding of the world around us to a shape that we, and only we, can see. I know this because I've felt that fear, and I still feel it pretty much every day, pretty much every time I sit down to write. It's there peeking out from behind every paragraph. It's there lurking behind every sentence. It's there in the slow, tentative movements I make towards trying to understand my characters, their motivations, their states of mind. And it's there, above all, in the moment in which an idea is born. That crazy, intoxicating moment when a loose series of thoughts or images seems to coalesce into something, some distillation of a feeling or a question that might just become the beginning of a book. What a stupid idea, the fear says then. I actually imagine him with a sort of slithering, sibilant voice, a bit like the snake in the film of The Jungle Book, but I'll spare you my acting skills. What a loser you are, even to think of it. Okay, so this has never been written before, but what makes you think that it's worth writing now? If I were you, I'd give this up straight away. You're bound to fail. I first met the fear about 4 years ago, when I reached something of a crossroads in my life as a novelist. Or an aspiring novelist, I should say, because I hadn't actually yet published a book. Over the last 10 years, I'd written 2 whole novels while working full-time as a journalist. It hadn't been easy. I'd given up evenings, weekends, holidays, when friends and family were out having fun, and I was sat in a dark room, talking to imaginary people, staring at my laptop screen. But obviously it was something I needed to do. I was driven to do it, and I had been for as long as I could remember. All I'd ever wanted to do was write fiction. And as I wrote those 2 novels, I had high hopes for each of them. I believed, I poured in my blood, sweat and tears, and I believed that each of these books might just be the novel that would launch me into the world, that would connect me with readers, that would see me a published author. But unfortunately, that wasn't what happened. You see, neither of those novels was working. They looked like real books, but they didn't smell like them. Something was missing, some key ingredient. They just weren't lifting off the page. They were standing in the shadow of other, far greater novels, rather than trying to break new ground of their own. As you can probably imagine, the moment I came to that realization was pretty depressing. I'd recently turned 30, which I appreciate is not old by any stretch of the imagination, but it was old enough for me to already feel like I was failing. As a young child, loving books, dreaming of writing them, and later as a student here in Cambridge, I'd never have imagined not having published my first novel by the time I was 30. It was all I'd wanted to do. It was the sum total of my hopes and ambitions. And so, for a while, I let myself be depressed. I mooched around. I ate an awful lot of cake, some of it looking suspiciously like this. I indulged in self-pity. I told myself it was pointless, that I'd never make a writer, never find anything original to say. How could I when everything worth saying had already been said? I looked at all those novels lined up on my shelves, all those amazing published authors whose work I so loved and admired. How could I seriously ever dream of joining them? How could I ever come up with anything as interesting or necessary or original as they had? And then, one morning, the fear entered my life. He, And I will point out at this point that I do picture the fear as a man. In fact, he looks slightly like Richard E. Grant in my head. Somewhere between Richard E. Grant and that walrus I showed you earlier. So like Richard E. Grant with fangs. We probably don't have time to go into the psychological implications of that right now, but you can picture whatever you like. For me, it was Richard E. Grant, in my head, with fangs, appearing in my head one morning, dragging on the coattails of an idea for a novel. A fragile concept that also appeared that morning and just refused to leave. The idea was this: to tell the story of one couple's relationship in 3 different versions. So weaving together into one novel 3 separate trajectories of how this couple's life, together or apart, might turn out. This idea felt exciting to me immediately in a way that no other idea ever really had. Neither of those 2 novels I'd finished, nor any of the countless other books and stories that I'd started and set aside. This idea felt different, it felt important. It was founded on something I was absolutely fascinated about, which are these tiny fulcrum points that draw our lives down one path rather than another. It didn't feel like any book I'd read before. It felt like the story I had to tell. And that was where the fear slipped in. With his slithering, sibilant voice, he whispered in my ear. He said, "Laura, I don't know what you're thinking now, but this is just crazy. You really need to give this up now, because no one's ever written 3 versions of the same characters into one book, and you just need to give it up. It's just never going to happen." Well, for a while, I listened to the fear. I did dismiss the idea as crazy, impossible, stupid. I set it aside. I ate some more cake. I just wondered what on earth I was going to do next. But then over the next few days, the next few weeks, something seemed to change in me. The fear seemed to shift his shape in my mind. I started to wonder whether the presence of the fear actually indicated that I was onto something, that this idea was worth pursuing. I started to question myself. I started to think that perhaps if I wasn't feeling the fear, as I hadn't been, not really, with either of those other 2 novels, I'd been doing something wrong. Perhaps I'd simply been standing in the shadow of the giants, all those writers I most admired and loved, and simply trying to reframe their ideas, their ways of seeing, as my own. If I was feeling the fear, perhaps I was being given a chance to step out from the shadow of those giants and write something innovative, something new. I decided that the fear wasn't actually so terrifying after all. He wasn't exactly cuddly. Those fangs and that scary Richard E. Grant face were a bit too scary for that, but he didn't terrify me as he had before. I took that idea, the idea of the one couple told in 3 different ways, and I started to write. And over the next 10 months or so, I wrote that idea into a novel. I gave it the title, The Versions of Us. And a couple of years after I finished that first draft, it became my first published novel and changed my life in ways I couldn't even have imagined. The most amazing thing about it has been, to my absolute amazement and delight, it seems to have connected with readers all over the world, and it's been translated into 23 languages. This is a selection of the different editions on my shelf in my study. And most importantly of all, it's given me the opportunity to realise my dream without meaning to sound too Pollyanna-ish. That is really what's happened. I get to now spend my time thinking about, talking about, and of course, writing fiction. But I will emphasise that even with that degree of success, even with my dreams coming true left, right and centre, the fear has not gone away. In fact, he came straight back as soon as I started working on my second novel, Greatest Hits. I had in mind an idea for my next book, which the fear deemed absolutely crazy. In fact, crazier than the one I'd written before. This time, I wanted to write the whole life story of a musician, a woman, a singer-songwriter, British, who in my head was somewhere between Joni Mitchell and Kate Bush. But what was really mad about this idea, and what really got the fear furious, was that I wanted to work with a singer-songwriter, a live, real-life one, not a fictional one, to create the songs that were reflected in the book, so to release an album that would come out alongside the book. This really felt exciting to me. It felt like an opportunity to truly break new ground, because as far as I was aware, this had never been done before. Well, as I say, the fear had an absolute field day with that. He thought I'd finally lost the plot. He just stood there, he folded his arms, he told me, "Forget it, Laura, this is ridiculous. No one's ever going to agree to do this with you. How are you going to get your publisher to talk to her record label? It's complete madness. Just stop now, before you embarrass yourself." But this time, I was ready for the fear. This time, I invited him in, offered him a cup of tea. I said, "Hey, good to see you again, welcome back." Because this time I was sure that his presence meant I was onto something, that this idea was worth pursuing. I did pursue it, and as you can see, the book exists and will be coming out this summer. And I've been working on an album with an amazing singer-songwriter called Catherine Williams that we'll release alongside it. And the whole experience has been so much more exciting, so much more life-changing than I could even have imagined. I'm telling you all this because, in the end, I do think that idea was worth pursuing, and that the fear, in the end, can be our friend. Today, we are thinking about giants, about whether we, as artists, songwriters, poets, must stand on the shoulders of the giants, of those who came before us, in order to see our way towards creating something innovative, something of worth. The point I'd like to leave you with is that it isn't enough simply to stand on those shoulders, taking in the view from up there. What we must do instead is do that, look out from where the giants have look through their eyes, but then direct our gaze inwards, at our own thoughts, our own experiences. It's not about disregarding the world around us or ignoring what other writers have to say, but about trusting in the uniqueness of our own perspective. There's an amazing series of documentary films by the musician Dave Grohl and his band Foo Fighters relating to an album they made called Sonic Highways. Each track on the record is inspired by a different American city, and in the film we see the band touring that city and then recording a track in a studio. In one of these films, inside one of those studios, there's a poster on the wall, and you guessed it, it says this: "Don't follow in the footsteps of the masters, seek what they sought." Now, I've researched this. It turns out this isn't actually Dave Grohl's own philosophy, which I found slightly disappointing, but it's that of a 17th century Japanese poet named Matsuo Basho. What I find so striking about this quote and its relevance today is that it reminds us that we, as artists or writers or scientists or researchers or anyone trying to do anything of worth in any field, we can't ever hope to repeat the triumphs of those who've come before. What we must do instead is try to do what they did, to look inside themselves and find out what they, and only they, really wanted to write or paint or research. When we do that, we can be sure that the fear will come calling, Richard E. Grant or the Walrus or whoever he is for you. He'll come with his claws out and his teeth bared. But it's then, as we stare back at him, that we can be certain we're in with a chance of creating something honest, original, and true. Thank you.